Welcome back everybody to our studies in AQA A-level history. This video specifically is going to be concerning ourselves by looking at Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister. And specifically, the AQA specification requires that we examine the following topic. We look at the role of Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister, as well as his successors. We'll talk about Pitt's relationship with the king, the 1784 election, which takes place immediately after he takes office, the reforms to finance, to administration, and to trade. And I guess the perfect place to start is to just think about Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister and how and when he comes to become Prime Minister. So, William Pitt the Younger was Prime Minister from around 1783 to 1801. He was born in 1759 and dies in 1806. He becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain in December 1783. This was at a remarkably young age of 24. That's an incredibly young age of 24. His tenure would last until 1801, and although he stepped down briefly, he would return to office in 1804. Holding the position until his death. Now, Pitt's leadership would mark a pivotal period in British history because it would be characterised by significant reforms in government finance and trade, as well as the challenges that were facing Britain with the embroiling of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. William the Younger's rise to power was, in fact, quite unusual. And the circumstances surrounding his appointment, in fact, reflects the delicate nature of the kinds of political manoeuvrings that we see in Britain during this time. The previous Prime Minister, for example, Lord North, had resigned following Britain's defeat during the American Revolutionary War between 1775 and 1783. The defeat of the American Revolutionary War and the resignation of Lord North led to a widespread political instability. Pitt's ability then to form a coalition government with the support from both the Tory and some of the Whig factions then allowed him to secure a stable position to become Prime Minister. His rise came at a time when the monarchy was still very influential, and his relationship with George III would play a key role in this particular leadership struggle. We'll get to that in a second. So George III initially preferred to have a more conservative leader during this time, but because of Pitt's political acumen, his youth and his reputation for competence, this allowed him to create a strong moral and political foundation. His relationship with King George III was cooperative and complex, is what I've written here in my notes. So George III, who had a quite strong belief in the power and the authority of the royal prerogative and the powers of the monarchy, would often have quite a lot of friction with the political leaders who would have to challenge that royal authority. Don't forget, the last few hundred years of history at this point was a history of the challenging relationship between the monarchy, who sought to exert almost autocratic powers, and that of the parliament, who sought to try and overrule and to try and suppress the power of the monarchy. And so George III, being somebody who believed quite strongly in the power of the monarchy, would have friction with the political leaders that sought to try and limit that authority. He would develop a positive relationship with Pitt, however, largely because Pitt was able to balance the demands of monarchy with the needs of expanding the influence and the power of the parliamentary system. And so in that kind of sense, Pitt was a loyalist in the terms of defending the monarchy and upholding the royal authority, the royal prerogative. But his vision for governance required the maintaining of support from Parliament, which often meant actually undermining his own loyalist sentiments and working with the political factions in the House of Commons that were a lot more critical of people like George III and critical of the idea of the royal prerogative. The king therefore trusted Pitt and allowed him to maintain authority, even in times of national crises, And we'll think about these national crises as we go on. One such example of this are the numerous Napoleonic wars against France. We also see that his trust is tested in the late 1790s, particularly when Pitt faces internal opposition, and we also get that King George III starts to go through a period of bouts of mental illness, which creates us further uncertainty. So as we know, in December 1783, Pitt the Younger becomes Prime Minister. And shortly after this takes place, in fact the next year in 1784, or a few months later, we see that the British government faces a general election. The outcome of this election would cement Pitt's political control and ultimately give him the mandate to pursue his reforms. If he loses this election, then his legacy is essentially pointless. No one would ever talk about him, since he would have been in office for a matter of a couple of months. Now, the context of the election was particularly very, very important. So the election followed the end of the American War of Independence. This is a period of instability in British politics. It is a period of instability when we think about the broader context of the empire and the defeat of the British in losing the colonies. Lord North's government had fallen, and Pitt had become Prime Minister under these challenging circumstances. What results is a political alliance of the Whigs and the remnants of North's government, which becomes known as the Fox-North Coalition. It had been unpopular after the defeat in America, but Pitt used the election to strengthen his own position. His strategy was very simple. He was going to emphasize the need for strong and stable government and the promise of financial and administrative reforms. He was therefore able to secure a majority in the House of Commons, with many members of Parliament being loyal to him, particularly due to his promises of financial reforms, but also his efforts to, and his promises to further stabilise the national economy. The success then of Pitt in this election marked a major shift in political power, and it is not for no reason that we sort of begin our period of study with the election of William Pitt the Younger in Britain. He was able to reshape the political landscape by positioning himself and his supporters as champions of financial responsibility, as well as national unity, particularly something that is very important in the wake of the defeat of the British in the American Revolutionary War. And so what were some of these policies when we think about reforms to finance, administration and trade? We'll think about these in more detail as we go on in future lessons' time, but we will talk about them from a sort of macro perspective here at this particular juncture. His tenure as Prime Minister is often remembered, particularly for these types of reforms in finance and administration and in trade. They are crucial at a very crucial point in British history for the reshaping of the economic landscape and facing the challenges of war, as well as the challenges of the national debt and the challenges of debt as the result of war. So in terms of reforms to finance, we see that national finance was reformed in a major way. Britain had accumulated a massive national debt. This was due to the costs of both the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, but also the American Revolutionary War. The national debt, for example, in 1783 was around £250 million, which is a lot of money today, is a ridiculous amount of money at the time in 1783. And so managing this debt was an essential part of Pitt's mandate when thinking about his governance in the future. He did a number of things. In 1786, Pitt's government negotiated something called a consolidation loan. This restructured and managed Britain's national debt more efficiently. It involved more consolidating of various debts into a single loan, which would then make it easier to pay off. If anybody ever gets into debt in the future, a good piece of advice is to try and negotiate a consolidation loan. It's very useful to sort of manage your debts and manage your finances. That's not official financial advice, that's just personal advice from me to you. By introducing these financial reforms, Pitt aimed to reduce interest payments and to try and stabilise the country's economy. In addition to this, that same year in 1786, Pitt established something known as the Sinking Fund, which was a plan to use the surplus from government revenues to reduce the national debt. This was one of the most successful reforms because essentially what this did was create a long-term strategy for trying to gradually reduce the national debt of the British economy. This national debt which had been caused quite significantly by major conflicts, the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War particularly. In terms of reforms to administration, we see a lot of modernization techniques taking place under this government system, making it less prone to corruption and making it more efficient. So, for example, Pitt strengthened the role of the Treasury Board, making it more effective in controlling and overseeing government spending. Pitt introduced various new taxes, such as excise taxes. These were taxes on goods like tea and alcohol. And this increased government revenue, which was then able to be used for government expenditure. He reformed tax collection to reduce the inefficiencies and improve compliance. In terms of broader reforms to trade and to industry, his policies included the signing of a series of commercial treaties with a number of European nations. In 1786, we see the Treaty of Paris, which improved Britain's trade relations and opened new markets. We also see the sympathy towards ideas of free trade, which sought to reduce ideas of protectionism. The idea of trying to protect national industries even at the cost of inefficiency. Now, although some of these attempts were limited, they would eventually lay the groundwork for Britain's embracing of free trade in the 19th century. And then finally, when we think about industrial reforms, although the Industrial Revolution was firmly underway at this point, its policies helped to stimulate the development of British industries, particularly in the textile industry and the ironworks industry. This was done by doing things like, for example, reducing internal tariffs and ensuring that raw goods could flow more easily to each individual factories. More on that in a future lesson. So Pitt's death was in 1806, and his reforms would have a lasting impact. After his resignation in 1801 due to health reasons and crisis of government, we see that Henry Addington briefly succeeds him as Prime Minister. Addington, however, struggled to maintain the strong political and economic foundations that Pitt had built, particularly in the face of the Napoleonic Wars. His premiership was marked by political instability and continuing challenges of managing Britain's involvement within European conflicts. Now, if you want to know more about the Napoleonic Wars and France in Revolution, I've just finished the A-level history for that particular topic. Some of you might be doing that topic at the same time as this one, but if you're not and you're just generally interested, you might be able to get a bit more context by going and having a look at those videos on the channel. After Addington then, Pitt the Younger's policies were continued by George Canning and Viscount Castlereagh. Although the issues of war and the complexities of managing the empire would continue to define British politics by and into the early 19th century. And so really to conclude here, we can see that his role as Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, was transformative. It was a leadership that was marked by a blend of conservative financial stewardship as well as liberal reforms that were aimed to stabilise the economy and try to improve administration. Now, the administrative and financial elements and developments are going to be looked at in far more detail in the next lesson when we cover economic developments, including industrialisation, the growth of the cotton and other industries, as well as changes in power and the results of and the conditions of agriculture during this period of history.